Welcome to In This Body, a podcast where we dive deep into the potent power of embodiment. I'm your host, Ailey Jolie, a psychotherapist deeply passionate about living life fully from the wisdom within your very own body. The podcast In This Body is a love letter to embodiment, a podcast dedicated to asking important questions like, how does connecting to your body change your life? How does connecting to your body enhance your capacity to love more deeply and live more authentically? And how can collective embodiment alter the course of our shared world? Join me for consciously curated conversations with leading experts. Each episode is intended to support you in reconnecting to your very own body. This podcast will be available for free wherever you get your podcasts, making it easy for you to stay connected to In This Body, the podcast with me, Ailey Jolie. Welcome back to In This Body. Today's episode is one that you won't want to miss, as today we dive into the heart of healing trauma with someone who's been a guiding light for many on their journey toward wholeness, Dr. Arielle Schwartz. Arielle is a clinical psychologist, trauma specialist, and renowned author whose work bridges the gap between somatic psychology, EMDR, and polyvagal theory. Her insights into trauma recovery go beyond mere survival. They open up pathways for real embodied healing. Arielle is the author of several books, including Becoming Whole, the Complex PTSD Workbook, a mind-body approach to regaining emotional control and becoming whole. Today, we'll explore some of the most crucial questions facing anyone who's on the path to healing. Questions like, why is embodiment so essential when addressing trauma? How do we even define trauma in a way that encompasses its full impact physically, emotionally, and spiritually? And what does it mean to heal? We'll also dig into one of the most influential frameworks in trauma work today, the polyvagal theory, and unravel some of the misconceptions surrounding it. Arielle, I'm so honored to have you here to share your wisdom. Welcome to In This Body, the podcast with me, Ailey Jolie. Arielle, the first question I want to ask you is a question that I started asking each and every guest at the start of our time together. And it is the simple but also very complex question of, what does being in your body mean to you?
Well, that's a lovely question. I just came back from being on a meditation retreat, which was a very embodied meditation retreat. And the word that came as a very clear, download while I was there was the word soft. And the feeling that I get when I experience easeful embodiment, right? Like that quality of just like settling in is pretty much that. It's like a very gentle invitation to in a sense just be myself. And we have words like authentic or whatever that means, but it's like it's such a light entry, right? There's nothing forced and there's nothing kind of dramatic about that entry point. But I don't know that embodiment or being in my body always felt like that really soft invitation, but it feels that way now. And I'm really, really grateful to have spent probably 30 years in this conscious journey of embodiment for it to feel so easeful now.
I love that. And it leads me to a question I wanted to ask you was, I know that yoga has been a huge part of what led you to the work that you do today. It's definitely what led me into the path of becoming a psychotherapist and getting curious about embodiment. But I would love to hear from you how you perceive the intersection of both yoga and maybe more formal meditation practices like sitting or silent retreats, as being almost in some ways, at least in my perception or experience, as foundational to embodiment in many ways.
Yeah. There's a lot in your question, and I'll sit with various pieces of it. Even yoga, which is such a broad term, I've had so many different variations of my yoga journey in I did my teacher training in 96. I'd been practicing daily for years before that. So it's been again, about 30 years of a very conscious adult relationship to yoga in various forms. For some time of that, it was Kundalini yoga. For some time of that, it was vinyasa and even Ashtanga, and a very kind of clear format in both of those, right? And Kripalu Yoga is where I did my teacher training, and it's got layers to it. But one of the layers of the Kripalu path is a much more spontaneous, or what's referred to as the surrender side of the practice, which is allowing your body to, your sensations to guide the movement, which is so different from put your body in this position and breathe a certain way, or you know or even in Iyengar, which I've also been involved with over the years, like find a certain alignment that is going to be the alignment for your body. And I think I resonate at this stage in my embodiment journey with yoga towards the more authentic or spontaneous flow, often, kind of integrating other somatic forms or pandicular movement, allowing the body to move like your favorite animal just waking up from a nap. One of my favorite phrases is an organic experience rather
Mm,
than an external shape that we're trying to place our bodies in. And I would say that similarly, my kind of where I'm drawn to in the meditation arena or the seated practice is one that is non-dogmatic and more
mm,
allowing of whatever needs to arise naturally, whether that's seated or a lie down, or whatever time of day it fits, rather than trying to um, always ensure that it's the same time and it's the same length of time. And I think anything that we're going to stick with, that we're going to stay with for a long period of time, has to feel good,
mm,
right? Otherwise, we're doing it and it either has a layer of aggression to it, or we're doing it and we won't keep it up.
mhm. Was there a moment for you where that shifted, where the rigidity started to crumble? I know for myself, right before the pandemic, I spent almost about 2 months in silence. And that
Mm,
was when my desire for really structured practice was just gone. After that, I was like, no, 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 no. And I wasn't
mm,
in a place that really required structured practice. I could move, I could be with my body. People were trained in somatic experiencing. But I'm curious to hear from you if there's a moment where
mm.
maybe that crumbled for you in some
It
ways.
really did. And I know exactly when it was. Um, So I was introduced to Kundalini Yoga in 1992, 1993, somewhere in there. And I was really, really drawn to it at first. The breath, the Kriya experience, the movement of the energy, the intensity of those breath and movement practices, even the mantra, and elements of what felt like this real clarity of someone telling me, well, if you do this, it's going to have this outcome.
Mm,
And I think so much of me wanted to believe that that was true, that I tried to like make it true, and so fast forward 1992, 1993 to 2002. About 10 years later, I was pregnant with my daughter. I was married, pregnant with my daughter, and I went down to a solstice retreat in New Mexico,
mm,
and was so excited to go and have 8 days of this practice. And you know, there's classes, and then there's long, long days of practice and partner practice and so forth. And everything in me rejected it.
mm,
Like it was so actually repulsive to me. once I got in there because I had never been to an event. I'd only been practicing on my own, and I think on my own I was adapting it to me more flexibly in a way that actually kind of worked. And the woman that taught me in the first place allowed for more flexibility in it. But when I went down to New Mexico, I saw the dogma. I was introduced more to, I think, community elements that I had been buffered from. And after that moment, I could never practice it again. I literally came out of that retreat, that experience, repulsed, disgusted with so many elements of the practice, the mantra to start, the rigidity, the messages, the keep up, and so forth. It really, really, like everything in me was like, no, 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 I don't ever want to do that again. And then I spent probably the next 10 years extracting what was it that I liked and what is it that really turned me off, and how can I actually take with me the parts of the practice that actually still you can find in how I teach, like the spiral movements, for example,
Mm.
the spinal movements. Like there's elements of the practice that feel so good, but not when they're done with a rhythm that isn't my rhythm, and a pace that isn't my pace, not when they're done in a way that's not really listening and honoring me. And so in those 10 years, I just started to put together like, what is my practice?
Mm.
And I stepped away from kind of all other practice, and if you do ever see me in a studio, because I still go to other teachers and I love that, most often I'm in the corner somewhat doing what they're offering, somewhat recreating it, and adapting it to what feels right for my body, and I trust that I can do that now.
Mhm. I'm also always in the corner, just kind of listening, hearing what's happening, but also just so deeply in tune with my body that I'm almost in a different class, but I love the collective experience and the energy, so I deeply resonate. A question I have for you, because I've noticed this in my clients, they are attracted to those spaces, but they'll often have parts of them that are like, oof, that feels a little rigid, or I like this yumminess here, but they don't have the capacity to do what you just elegantly described is what are the parts that I really like that's leading me here? And what is the stuff that I need to leave behind because it doesn't resonate? Do you have any words of wisdom for people in that process of actually really asking what is it that I need and is resonating and what is maybe not a fit and I need to leave that behind so I can connect to my body.
Hmm. I think it goes back to your first question, actually, which
Mm.
is what does it mean to be in your body or to be embodied? And I think that another answer to that question is listening and to be attuned, to be sensitive or sensing the felt sense experience. And how we learn to listen to ourselves is taught to us by how we were listened to, especially how our bodies were attuned to when we were infants and, very, very young children. And so if we, in some way or another, had to fit in our family system or in order to belong or in order to attach, if we had to abandon our own authentic self-expression for the sake of relationship, it confuses that inner listening, right? It leads us to adopt what, Winnicott back in the 1940s, here you are in London, right? Thinking about
Mhm.
Winnicott, who's, from that area. He referred to this as moving away from the true self into the false self,
Mhm.
where we are literally embodying for the sake of the other rather than for the sake of ourselves. And so if that's been entrained in us in some way, And then we move into adulthood, and we're still not quite differentiated from the fact that if I really honestly, truly be myself, I might be rejected from the clan, right? Like I might lose
Mhm.
my attachment and my connection. And for an infant, that's life and death. That's pure survival. As an adult, of course, we can be different and honor ourselves, and ultimately we can recognize that, most people will accept and appreciate, even respect that. And those that don't are probably not our people.
I'm resisting my urge to dive even deeper into the socialization that can get in the way or limit our capacity to be embodied. I'm just gonna like put it over there, but I'll come back to it because I want to hear your definition of embodiment because I find they're always so personal and so unique to each practitioner and clinician. And not only your definition, but if you could walk us through kind of what you see to be some of the perceivable steps. One that I would also deeply align with you is like learning to listen.
Mhm. 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 Yeah. So embodiment, I guess I come back to something that you just named, but I really want to emphasize it, is a very personal process. It's a
Mhm.
very personal journey. And what embodiment means for me might actually not be what embodiment means for you or for anyone else listening. And I think it's really important to start there, that yeah, we can even get into a little bit of like the science of what embodiment is, and I'm happy to share some of that. But I think it's at a felt sense level. It's actually not for me to tell someone that if you can't in some way kind of like feel the nuance of your heartbeat or your belly or where your liver is or your pinky toe, that somehow you're not embodied. Right? It, we have many different ways of being embodied creatures in this world. And
Mm,
I think that the range of that is something that needs, that the diversity of that, right, actually needs a little bit more room and respect. Um, that said, if we look at a little bit of the science of embodiment, which I spend a lot of time doing because I write a lot of books about embodiment, um, I really like the work of a man named Alan Fogel, who
mm,
wrote a book called Body Sense, and he has some other books as well. And he's also a Rosen body work
mm,
practitioner. And the the perspective of embodiment is this kind of complex interaction of the way that our brains, our minds, are perceiving the feedback that we're getting from all of our sensory systems being basically what we see and feel and taste and hear and touch. I don't know what else, what other sense we have, but our taste, our five senses. And then we have our interoceptive feedback. Interoceptive is what we feel on the inside, right? We have our five senses: exteroception, the outside. Interoception is, warmth, temperature, tension, um, the feeling that lets us know that we're having an emotion, the feeling of the heartbeat, the feeling of the gurgles in your stomach, all lets you know that you're hungry or thirsty, right?
mm,
So that's the interoceptive feedback. And then we have proprioceptive feedback, which is where is my body in space? And it gives us a sense of weight in relationship to gravity and works with your vestibular system to basically locate this overall felt sense of you or the container of you. And now we get to the vagus nerve, which I obviously write a lot about, but the vagus nerve is going to communicate all of that sensory input
mm,
into the brainstem. And then your brainstem can utilize that and it moves upwards into the somatosensory cortices in the brain, the parts of the brain that are going to register all of that information. Then we reflect on it using kind of prefrontal cortex, upper brain centers to reflect on all of that sensory feedback. And we construct, and this is an important word, but we construct a bodily felt sense from all of that sensory input. And then we'll, in some way have another layer that says, well, this is me, or this is
Mm,
not me, right? We can even have that. And I think it's important to name with this that when we have an accumulation of life experiences that either enhances or even overwhelms those sensory processing systems, sometimes we get a whole lot of flooding of felt sense input into the brain. And when we attune to the body, we're actually getting more than the brain can even process.
mhm,
And sometimes our sensory processing systems are dialed down, in which case we're not getting enough feedback to the brain that lets us know where our bodies begin and end in space, or what we're feeling on the inside, or whether we have to go to the bathroom, or whether we, are full.
mhm,
And so then we recognize that there's this complexity between how the brain is taking that information and how much of that information is getting to the brain, that then that feeling of this is me is kind of loaded perceptually on how much of that sensory input we have access to.
mhm. And this is the beautiful place of where socialization and culture comes into. This kind of invisible sensory pieces of information and how aware we are of them and how much we're not aware of them and how much they inform the piece of me. Um, could you speak a little bit more to those pieces? Because I often feel like sometimes they get missed in the realms of like polyvagal theory, or when we start getting into the science of embodiment, somehow that piece gets dropped. Not always, but sometimes.
Yeah. I don't think it's meant to get dropped, but
No.
I do agree with you that sometimes it gets dropped. And one of the theories that I've been drawn to in the embodiment arena
Mhm,
for a long time, there's kind of two partners theories that I write about and talk about. And one is what we'll call intercorporeality.
mhm,
And this is this understanding that the corporeal being that I am, the embodied felt sense of Arielle, is not cannot be separated from the environment that I'm in, the people that I'm interacting with, and this, the overall spaces, cultural spaces, physical spaces that we're in. And classic example is it feels very different to be me walking through the busy streets of New York City than it does in the mountains of Colorado. The very different embodied felt sense. And and therefore all of these social and cultural experiences are actually very much informing my own felt sense of self. And that can then also be, let's go to a family system, the body language, the facial expressions, the voice tone. It's going to shape what's available for a child and also what's not available.
mhm,
Which movement repertoires are not commonly used in this family? We just don't move that way. And which movement repertoires or ways of being and facial expressions and emotional expressions are part of this family? And so then we are being kind of shaped by, let's say, family environment. Let's
mhm,
expand that to community and social structure that we're surrounded by. Let's expand that into culture and what this culture does versus that culture. How loud our voice might be, how much space we take up. Yeah. So the partner concept to what I'm describing is something else that's called embodied culture.
mhm,
Yeah. And the embodied culture is that learned experience that, whether it's the culture of the family system or the culture of school or the culture of church or the culture of this group of people, this is how we move our bodies or don't move our bodies.
mhm.
Yeah.
And that, as we know, our physiology forms our psychology. And then you're back in that feedback loop of going, of it being more concrete. I would love to hear from you because it's something I really deeply appreciate in your work is the grace and I'll use the word ease, in which you use to bring polyvagal theory into the work and how you support individuals. Um, what led you to that theory? Like I know
Oh,
the founder, those
mm,
pieces, but what pieces for you were you like, that's yummy. I'm going to incorporate that in.
yeah. I think one of them was that back in the 1990s, when I first started studying somatic psychology, I was doing my master's thesis work on the impact of stress, vicarious trauma, and burnout. And I was really curious because I, as a new clinician in the field, was bumping up against a lot of vicarious kind of taking on what other people were feeling or expressing, and I felt pretty overwhelmed by my own empathy system, and I was bumping up against burnout, and I was like, well, I want to be in this field for a really long time. If I'm already feeling this in my internship, how am I going to make this work sustainable? So I started to do a lot of studying about stress basically and how stress impacts our own physiology, and I was also doing a lot of my own internal work to work with the parts of me. We can talk parts another time, but right, but the parts of me that felt responsible to take on energy or emotions from the people around me. And that was a learned pattern for me early on in life. But nonetheless, this studying of stress, a lot of the early literature when I was writing this in the 1990s was basically a dichotomous picture of our autonomic nervous system, and that our sympathetic nervous system was basically the cause of all stress, and our parasympathetic nervous system was, that relaxation and recovery and rest and digest response. And there's partial truth to that story, but I think where I was initially turned on by the polyvagal theory was this understanding that actually that autonomic dichotomous system is only part of the story, and there's a much deeper, nuanced understanding that we actually also want to befriend our sympathetic system. It's mobilization, and it's what allows us to play and feel empowered and energized. And I was like, okay, so if that's true, then we can't make the sympathetic nervous system the bad guy here. And the parasympathetic system, while yes, indeed, it's our relaxation response, that's also not the whole story,
Mhm.
because sometimes our parasympathetic can take us into more of what feels like depression and collapse and shutdown and feigned death and a faint response and all of that. Okay, so that's not the good guy here, right? Like it took it and it made everything much more nuanced.
Mm,
So that was the first thing that like really excited me about this, was that it led for um, a really enriched dialogue, even just with me and my own nervous system, to better understand myself and to reclaim my own capacity to feel joy and
mm,
my own capacity to rest well and my own capacity to kind of like pull out the parts of me that were stuck and shut down and really, really lovingly hold those parts and kind of bring them back to life, right? And also kind of respect the wisdom and intelligence that they held for me. So much there. The other thing, and it goes back to the question that you just asked me about, kind of socialization of embodiment, is that when we look at a lot of the literature on what we'll call vagal regulation of the body mind relationship, like
mm,
the vagus nerve indeed has these deep connections to gut belly brain,
mm,
heart, heart rate, heart blood pressure, respiratory rate, and the functions of your brainstem to help manage things like your digestion, your sleep
mm,
wake cycles, your sexual response. All of those layers are so deeply intertwined. But if we only look at the nervous system as what I'll call a closed circuit system, then we're missing a really key element that comes back around again to, we're not a closed system. No man
mhm,
is an island. No person is an island. We are deeply impacted by each other. Hence my curiosity about my very strong empathy response, right? Like, okay, so my nervous system is responding to you and to everyone else, and to the news that I watch, or to the nature that I surround myself with. So if we have an open circuit nervous system, a social engagement system, as Dr. Steve Porges puts it, then that brings this whole beautiful opening to things like co-regulation. How do we nourish and benefit from each other's presence? And co-dysregulation, right? How do we sometimes impact each other in detrimental ways?
Mhm.
Yeah.
You're touching on something that I have read throughout your work. In some ways, it's explicit, in some ways, it's implicit. But this acknowledgement that embodiment or trauma healing is, yes, individual in the way that it's one on one in the room when you're with a client, but it's also deeply collective. I would love to hear from you how you perceive embodiment and the work that you do to be a form of collective healing.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. So there's so many layers to that. I think the
Mhm.
first that I'll say is that you cannot actually separate out individual healing from generational healing, from collective healing. They are actually all happening all at once, all the time.
Mhm.
It's just our minds that separates them into different categories. Now, that said, I think we don't always perceive that they're all happening all the time. And we're not using language that maybe welcomes that perception into the room. But once we just sit with this maybe even kind of ground breaking understanding that indeed, if corporeality is true, if embodied culture is true, then what is happening between me and me on my very own yoga mat is me and me and all of the exchanges that I have had with others, me and the felt sense in me that responds to the stories that I know about the generations that precede me, and that epigenetics that carry stories that I might not even consciously know, and to the collective response of what is kind of moving through in currents that are seen and unseen around us all the time. So the very personal journey is equally transpersonal.
Mhm.
And when I'm working one on one with another, it's almost daily that those multiple layers come into the room. Today, for example, there was a session in which we were working with individual history and this individual's nervous system states and embodied felt sense of each of those states and particular personal stories. And then at one point, it rolled right into a generational story and how that impacted attachment to attachment to attachment between, grandmother to, mother, to her daughter. And that generational story was indistinguishable from the historical events that were happening for each of those generations, including today's political arena and what's happening in the world right now. So when we're listening and feeling in for that, it will show up. And I think part of what we can do as practitioners is keep that door open.
Mhm.
Because when we keep that door open and we're perceiving the possibility of that, those themes will come through the door. Uh, can I say one more thing?
Yeah.
I was attending a training. This goes maybe 2020 with Resmaa Menakem,
Mm.
and my grandmother's hands author and beautiful speaker on this very topic. And one of the things that he got asked a question when we were both presenting at the same conference, and I was listening in on his, and he got asked a question by one of the participants about how do you know when there's generational trauma themes showing up in a session? And he said it's generally energetic.
Hmm.
And so it brings into another layer here of like part of what we're sensing when we're sensing embodiment is the energetic shifts that happen. Like shock can feel very stuck, expanded, right? And shock, even generations back, sometimes there's still like this, that feeling, or there's a flight response perhaps that's showing up in like this restlessness and this urgency, or maybe there's a trapped feeling that shows up, or a heaviness and a contraction. And so when I offer up kind of noticing your own embodied experience as feedback about your nervous system, that includes noticing mind, quality of mind. It includes noticing body. It includes noticing your breath, noticing the emotions that are present, and noticing that energetic state.
Why do you perceive that the energetic piece of embodiment is often pushed aside or not so named? Because it's something that I definitely, in moving to London and starting to work with clients, the energetic piece, I was like, whoosh, this is really different than
Mm,
the other bodies that I've been in the room with in regards to the intergenerational trauma, the intersections of identity, how those systems of oppression move through this culture is very different. And there was such a different energetic tone in the room. Do you have any ideas as to why that often or sometimes also gets left out of the conversation?
Oh, I think that unfortunately, sometimes the idea that we're observing or tracking or attuning to energetic shifts somehow got kind of put in the spiritual arena,
Mhm.
and spiritual psychology has or even transpersonal psychology, however you want to put that, often gets kind of put on the outskirts of mainstream psychology in general. So we don't get taught in grad school for psychology to
Mhm.
to observe or even use the word energy to talk about it. What's lovely for me about also being a yoga practitioner is that energy is spoken about in that arena very much, and that we recognize in the yogic traditions that we have multiple bodies, right? So when
Mhm.
I'm talking about tracking mind, body, breath, emotion, energy, that this 5 point check-in that I'm naming, that's based on the yogic system of the koshas.
Mhm.
And so that we have a mental body, we have a physical body, we have a breath body, a pranic body, and that we can train ourselves to observe all of those bodies, not just this one that, we most often associate with body.
Mhm. As you were reminding me of the koshas, what was going through my head was I love somatic experiencing. I'm trained in it, but was Saibam and how you know, energy's not really in there, even though it is almost the crucial component of that type of observation. Um, One thing that I also really appreciate about you, before you got on this podcast, I did some time. I was like, I'm gonna listen to all of her recent podcasts. I've read the books. But I heard you describe your work as resilience informed therapy. And when I heard that, I was like, I want to hear more about this. Could you describe what that means and also what led you to that specific languaging? Because it's quite beautiful and unique.
Yeah. Yeah. So I got trained as a trauma-informed therapist
Mhm.
back in, 2001. That was really like a pretty rising term, and it's still used a lot
Mhm.
today to be trauma-informed. Yeah. But I trained in somatics first, then I trained in EMDR therapy in 2001. And both somatics, as you know, and EMDR are, focus of they lend themselves very well to working with trauma. Great.
Mhm.
And what often happens in the trauma informed lens is that we are really turning our attention towards the symptoms of trauma, the stories and narratives of trauma, the impact of those adverse events on our sense of self and our identity, the impact of those events, and when I say impact, the negative impact of those events on our relationships. And and very often, when we're doing trauma informed intakes with our clients, we're gathering all of that data of the symptoms and the problematic impact of the difficult life events. The challenge then comes in because when you, as a clinician, spend all day long just focusing on adversity, it's pretty heavy.
Hmm.
And your clients come into the room and you've just spent an hour focusing just on symptoms and what's wrong. It gets pretty heavy and pretty contracted. And I think it's just much more likely that they leave the room going, well, gosh, man, there's something really wrong with me, right? So the resilience informed lens is by all means not to ignore or push away or bypass the distress or the symptoms of disturbance or that adversity. It's just to broaden the lens so that we can also pay attention to and what's going well. And where is the nourishment for you? And where is there some resource in the room? And how does it feel just to be here and have a little bit of orientation of your attention to what lets you know that this is a safe enough space for you right now? And that shift is like giving this bigger container that now has more spaciousness and capacity to turn toward this stuckness without over defining ourselves with it, without over identifying with it.
Absolutely. I love what you shared. It reminds me, years ago, I went and studied trauma recovery at Harvard Medical School, and I was around very inspiring people. I felt very blessed to be there, but the room felt so heavy because it was more training around that piece. And so I left, not really knowing the puzzle piece that you just described, but I left and went and trained as a sex therapist. I was like, I'm going to help people find play and joy in their body. And that was beautiful, but it led to kind of what you're describing of like, how do I actually give my clients in that room for 50 minutes, maybe an experience that they don't have anywhere else. Pain and suffering and trauma symptoms follows them around every single day. How do we
Yeah.
use our 50 minutes to just tap into something else? So then that can be the thread that maybe starts to strengthen and leads them through our sessions and their time outside of our sessions. I would love to hear from you. Um, what keeps you feeling invigorated and alive in the work that you do, acknowledging so much of what you have offered is for those who have experienced trauma and are in that heaviness?
Yeah. You know, one of the things, there's probably a lot of things that I could say in response to that of like how much time I spend during any given day focusing my attention on what nourishes me, right? What brings me pleasure, what brings me joy, and being able to come from that place when I work with others. So even thinking about a session I had earlier today where there was a lot of heaviness in that room, there's no doubt there's a lot of pain and grief and generational trauma and so forth. And because it's an oscillating process or a pendulating process, right? The whole session is pendulating toward that pain and heaviness, and then toward a little bit of nervous system resource, and
Mm.
toward that pain and heaviness. And then at one point, the resource became I have these floor to ceiling windows that look out over trees that sit on a pond. And there were these three squirrels running around the trees. And the three squirrels ended up coming into part of the session. They didn't come in the room, obviously, but they were like an essential part of the session because there was so much play. And at one point, the client said, "Oh, look at how they embody their tails." It was so
Mm.
fun because a lot of the work was about really breathing all the way down into the pelvis and the tailbone and the sacrum and being in the root, which, trauma often pulls us up and out of that root.
Mm.
And but anyway, this just being like one example of the fact that the work doesn't burn me out because it's this oscillating work between heaviness and resource. And as soon as resource is coming in the room, my whole system reorients back to what
Mm.
that feels like in my body. And if I am teaching like any vagal toning practice, I had a vagal toning class I did earlier today. I was leading it. I'm doing the practices right along with
Mm.
the class, right? And so, or my therapeutic yoga, I'm moving with the group, right? So I'm just constantly layering in And then I have other personal practices, my own meditation, my own yoga, my daily walks in nature. And that just fills me up. They're non-negotiables.
Mm. I love how they're non-negotiables. Non-negotiables, but as you described at the start of this, also body-led in many
Yeah,
ways and what your body needs.
totally.
Um, Another question that I would love to hear from you on is this piece of resilience that you've named. How do you hold intergenerational wisdom and intergenerational
Mhm.
resiliency in the work that you do with clients? There's such a focus on intergenerational trauma, but for myself, I can definitely honor and say like some of the most healing experiences I've had is tapping into that collective wisdom in my intergenerational lineage.
Yeah, yeah, that's beautiful, right? I mean, obviously you're here,
Mhm.
so, you know, someone survived to get you
Yeah,
here.
exactly.
A few of them did,
Yeah.
right? It's pretty remarkable in itself. And I love that you're naming that piece. I think that that shifting toward the resilience lens is we can find it at every level, right?
Mm,
We talk a lot about vicarious traumatization, but we forget that vicarious resilience is also a thing.
mm,
And, as you named, how might we tap into that? Sometimes it's about feeling your way into where is there a well ancestor within the lineage.
mm,
And sometimes we just have to imagine one because we can't find them in the known family tree. But we have to, in a sense, feel our way back or feel our way around in the lineage until we can sense what that well ancestor might be like. You know?
mm.
Sometimes we have to kind of draw upon people that embody that, whether they're real people or fictional or in a movie or, someone that we met on the bus one day, but like we can be like, oh, wow, they embody joy. Funny, I posted on my Facebook page yesterday, the Dr. Arielle Schwartz on Facebook, I posted this little YouTube video that happened across my feed. I get good things in my feed because I cultivate, I think I cultivate well in the social media spheres. And I got this beautiful video of an interview with a 95-and-a-half-year-old woman
Mm,
who was being interviewed about kind of like her secrets to life. And she was basically speaking about awe and about her own kind of wisdom sharing. Beautiful, beautiful woman. She kept quoting poetry from T.S. Eliot and just her embodying playfulness and having a second childhood, as she put it. But I saved it and I reposted it primarily for me because I knew that I wanted to remember to go back and watch it again. And I thought to myself, oh, that's who I want to be when I grow up.
mm. I love that.
Right. So we need to sometimes look for models. If we can't
Mm,
find them in the generations behind us, we can borrow from somebody else's lineage and be like, oh, that's a beautiful modeling of what 96 can look like.
yeah. I have experiences of that, of being around women, and I'm like, that is exactly what I hope to feel one day in my body, just the little inkling
Yeah.
that you've given me by being in your presence. Um, is there anyone that stands out to you that has really inspired your embodiment journey? I'm always so curious to hear um, how someone else's embodiment radiates through generations or just through the culture as well.
Yeah. There's two that come to mind quite immediately.
Hmm.
And this is kind of a funny thing that I'll say, but I think very often in the somatics field, a lot of the male contributors get named a lot
Yes.
and get kind of venerated and the field wouldn't be what it is now if we didn't have Bessel's book. Let's just say that. Like, thank you, Bessel,
Yes.
for The Body Keeps the Score. It has brought somatics so much more into the forefront, even in
Mm.
more traditional centralized psychology. So thank you
Mhm.
for that. And when I think personally about who has shaped my journey personally as an embodied human and my profession that is so centered around embodiment, all of those people are women.
Mm.
Right? And women, I can broaden out women, like the midwives that helped me bring my babies into the world, women that were all the founders and primary teachers of my somatic studies in where I went to school. Christine Caldwell being one of them,
Mm,
Susan Aposhian being another, really, really beautiful. She was my body mind centering teacher for 3 years, body mind psychotherapy. And Mukara Meredith. These are names that people might not know or have heard of,
mm,
but really, really beautiful mentors of mine. Mukara is a Hakomi teacher
mm,
and held so much sacred space for me for years and years and years. Betty Cannon, who wrote the foreword to the Post Traumatic Growth Guidebook, has been my mentor since 2008, and I still meet with her monthly. She's 83, you
mm,
know, yeah, like really, really beautiful. And top of that list is my mom.
mm.
Yeah. Her commitment to her own healing journey, and her many years of her own therapy, and her willingness to every single time I teach a yoga class, she shows up. I won't tell her age because she'll be mad at me. I'm just teasing. But yeah, let's just say she's also in her 80s. She comes to
Mhm.
every single
Oh,
vagal toning yoga class offering that I do. I taught a 7-week ancestral healing somatics course this summer. She came to that with me. I mean, it is so beautiful that she and I have been able to enter into this healing journey together. And I know that it's been her commitment to her own journey that has afforded me the privilege to be who I am and do what I do.
we definitely share that. And I'm assuming that you also being a clinician are aware of how rare that can be to have a mother who stands in that with you. Um, yeah, that's definitely mine as well. And I love that you named some of those men, like well, you didn't name him specifically, but like Gabor and Peter and Bessel and oh, yes, they've created the field in the public zeitgeist kind of way, but a lot of their work does have origins that are really from women and in more feminist thought, or Marion Woodman, who kind of extended Jung's legacy into somatics and the unconscious being in the body and how that trickled forward. Even the title, The Body Keeps the Score, always gives me a little bit of a chuckle because it's so masculine in just nature. I'm like, what would it be like if the body kept the story? Like, kind of interesting places.
I like
Um,
that.
my
Yeah.
last question for you today, for the listener who is so new to the idea of embodied living, what do you think is most important for them to know about maybe the concept of embodiment just in general?
Mm. Slow. Slow is fast, less is
Mm.
more. I think, like having been in the field of somatics for some 30 years and then watching this kind of new wave of somatics coming in, I
Mhm.
think there's a lot of emphasis out there that like, you can do this somehow fast, or like this is the breakthrough practice, or, shaking somehow means it's real release, all of these things that have more of a drama component. And that's not new to the field. The cathartic emphasis came in the 1970s, y'all. Like that was, yeah, right. And, bioenergetics and Reichian work. And so it's been around for a long time. And the field itself has actually evolved to
Mhm.
recognize that titration, to borrow Peter Levine's term, right? But like moving towards little bits of activation and coming back and letting that fully integrate is actually really, really nourishing. This doesn't mean that catharsis is somehow exiled out of the room. Catharsis can happen, and when it's unforced. We just allow for it to arise when there's enough safety for that to happen. And so I just am going to kind of, in a sense, end where I started with soft, right?
Mm. Yes. I love that you brought in the relatively debunked primal scream catharsis of the 1970s. It's like one of my favorite topics when I see somatic present, how it's presented. I'm like, oh. but we all have our time, and I definitely, had to go through my cathartic process too.
That's right, me too. But when you look back at the, like the people that did the primal scream, they ended up with like nodes on their vocal
I
cords. Like,
know.
we want to end up with like harming ourselves in the process of healing.
Yes, soft. I love it.
Mhm.
Thank you so much for everything that you've offered in this hour, but all of your work. It was so foundational and a part of the master's program I did at Pacifica in somatic studies. And I was blessed enough in the master's program before that in counseling psych, where I actually had profs that told me to go read your books, and it was integrated into our studies. So yeah, I know. Well done, them. Um, is there anything specifically that you have coming up that you would like the listener to know about? We'll have all your notes and books and the show notes, but is there anything specific?
Thank you. I have a lot of things coming up. I'm like,
Okay.
oh, I don't know. Um, I would say some exciting things that are coming up, and one of them does involve some of those great men. But I'm excited about this one. I'm going to be in Costa Rica
Mm,
I have to remember the month, in February at Blue Spirit, and that's going to be myself and Bessel van der Kolk and Richard Schwartz and David Primal and Miten and some others, and we're all going to be
mm,
doing basically a trauma healing week together, and I'm going to be focusing on post-traumatic growth, and I think that's going to be a really, really special event. So that's up on my
mm.
website. I have resilienceinformedtherapy.com as well as drarielleschwartz.com, and so you can find out about my events on there. And then I'll be at the Omega Institute in New York in June of this is all 2025 coming up. So in June doing a full week program retreat on vagal toning, and it's going to be nourishing as well. And yeah, so just nice upcoming things. But the best way to know about what's upcoming is to subscribe to my newsletter, and that's again both websites. There's opportunities to subscribe.
Beautiful. Again, thank you so much for your time. It was so lovely to get to spend some time with you. If you found value in this episode, it would mean so much to me for you to share the podcast with friends, a loved one, or on your social platforms. If you have the time, please rate and review the podcast so that this podcast reaches a larger audience and can inspire more and more humans to connect to their bodies too. Thank you for being here and nurturing the relationship you have with your very own